Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Quit Your Witchin' by Dakota Cassidy. Narrated by Hollie Jackson. Chapter 1. Crispin Alastair Winterbottom. What now, Miss Cartwright? I ignored his aggravated sigh and my urge to lob something at the wall. You know exactly what. This will never work if you keep trying to land a date with our client's deceased lover. Understood? I whisper-yelled at my partner in spy. Bah, he whisper-yelled back. It's not a date, Stevie. I was just asking if Kitty liked to dance. When has a trip around Plain Light Fantastic ever had anyone fun stomper? I ran my hand over my temple before giving it a good squeeze to ease the tension. That's not the point, and you know it. When we agreed to do this, reopen Madam Zoltar's with me as her successor, you agreed to play by my rules when contacting the dead. Nonsense. I am playing by your rules, Dark Overlord. You said nothing about asking a client's deceased loved one if they had a hobby. Not a solitary word. Did she, Belfry? Belfry, my tiny cotton ball bat familiar, stretched and yawned from the bed he'd made out of one of the leaves of an elephant ear plant. I hate to side with the Cumberbatch-alike ghost, but he's kind of right, boss. Chiding my ghost for not playing by the rules was as close to pointless as one got, but I did it out of habit. Much the way any mother of a toddler who needed repetitive reinforcement would. Winterbottom, or Win, as I called him, is my afterlife connection, my conduit to the other side. Really, that's the absolute truth. Plainly speaking, he's a dead British spy who barged into my life, or my ear, if we're being literal, just over a month or so ago when he needed my help and wouldn't leave until I caved. If I helped him solve a murder, in return, he'd help me move on with my new life here in Ebenezer Falls, Washington, as a shunned, powerless, broke ex-witch, and give me all his worldly possessions as a reward of sorts. Worldly possession being a decrepit old Victorian in crumbling graffiti-filled disrepair and more money to renovate it than I could spend in 5 lifetimes. The truth. My hand to God. That really happened. Though according to him, he'd already planned on giving me his house and money before I'd agreed to help solve the murder. He said my afterlife connections were enough of a reference to consider me a worthy recipient. Also, according to him, that was all he needed to ensure his monster of a house, what I now lovingly call Mayhem Manor, would be in good hands. Wynne never reminded me of what he'd so generously given my bat familiar Belfry and I. He never rubbed it in. He'd never asked for anything more than his initial request in return. But he sure made up for it in other ways. Like today. We'd taken over Madam Zoltar's tarot card reading and medium business here in town in her honor. Madam Zoltar's death was the murder I mentioned, and what brought Wynne and I together in the first place. Now it was the glue sticking him to my backside. I longed for the days when I was a witch, and I desperately missed communicating with spirits, my specialty before I was shunned. Another long story. Running Madam Zoltar's helped ease that ache a bit, even if I was only communicating by proxy. Also something of note, shunned is a kind word for what happened to me. After I literally had the witch slapped out of me by an angry spirit, I ended up booted out of my coven back in Paris, Texas, when I became mortal again by the very leader I'd have trusted with my soul. And it hurt. Stung like no tomorrow. My fearless leader was Baba Yaga, in case having a name to attach to my tragedy is necessary, and the longer I thought about how she'd dumped me like a fickle girl dumps a 90s boy band without listening to a word of my defense, the less I was able to continue to outwardly support what she'd allowed to happen to me. I worked hard not to be bitter because technically she was still Belfry's head honcho, but as of late, the work had become harder. Anyway, once the dust settled, after solving Madam Zoltar's murder case, Win and I concocted a plan. One that had given me a reason to get up in the morning. I'd be the new medium, hence my turban and caftan. Another shout-out to Madam Zoltar and her keen, quirky fashion sense. Hey, girl. And Win would be my legit conduit to the afterlife. Being that he was in limbo and had no plans to change his afterlife Facebook status to crossed over anytime soon, our arrangement worked just fine. So far. We'd agreed to take this journey together in memory of Madam Zoltar, a beloved figure here in Ebenezer Falls, and also someone Win had become very fond of just prior to her death. But we had rules and stipulations to this agreement. Though, hear this, I'd never take money to contact the deceased from someone who was in the throes of grief. Never. I'd also never take their money if I couldn't truly communicate with said deceased. So Win and I decided not only would we work as a team, we'd donate whatever the customer could afford to pay, yes, you read that right, sliding scale seances, to various charities, animal rescue being high on my list, and use only what we needed to pay the store's expenses. And that's what led me here, to Spy Guy's otherworldly philandering. I looked at the picture of Kitty Tolucci, the one our client, Edward Randolph, had brought to the reading. A picture of his lover, her luscious ebony hair falling down her back in a riot of curls, lying against the alabaster skin of her shoulders, decked out in a strapless red lycra dress, which, hugging her abundant breasts and accentuated her tiny waist and lush hips, she was beautiful. I pointed to it with the tip of my index finger. You were not asking about her hobbies, Win. I know it, and you know it. I beg your pardon, he spat in that uppity British tone of his. Does Kitty look like a woman who hasn't danced a time or two, Win? He gasped with his high-pitched mock Stevie girly squeal. You're stereotyping. That's against the law. Point for the dead spy, Belfry chirped, stretching his wings. It's called profiling, and I'm not a cop, but even if I were, I'm really not profiling. Kitty was a dancer. Burlesque. You'd know that if you weren't busy looking into her deep, dark, velvety eyes. Now quit trying to pick her up and help me help Edward find her last will and testament so he can prove to her evil ex that Snape is now his cat because Kitty left him to Edward in her will. Who names that cat Snape? Win balked. Repositioning my turban, I smoothed my colorful caftan and made a face. Women who like Harry Potter and Alan Rickman? Ah, a fellow Brit. This bodes well for me. He purred in his whiskey-smooth voice. No, there is no boding anything. Now get out there to that table and let's get her done. One more swish of your flirty ghost hair and it's curtains for you, international man of intrigue. If I could actually see Win, I'd bet $5 he was rolling his eyes at me right now. Fine, fine. You're the boss. Just remember, the spirits respond well to me and my hair swishing. I made a face at the air. When I was a witch, I never had to swish my hair to get the spirits to communicate with me. They just did. No bribes, no flirting, no cash exchanging hands. She speaks the truth, Winterbutt, Belfry agreed, tucking back down into the green leaf. Though, cash would have been nice. Win scoffed in that way he had when he wanted me to hear he was disgusted. That's because you're a woman, Stevie. The game of pickup is not a two-way street. It's a proven fact that women are far more successful at picking up men than the other way around. I bet that fact-checker was a man. A man who didn't want to admit we just have better game. And you basically just admitted you're trying to pick up Kitty. I pointed to the door separating us from the room we'd privately dubbed Seance Command Central and said, "Now go. We need to finish up because I have a lunch date with Forrest." "Oh, then by all means," Wynne drawled with his uppity British lilt. "We shouldn't waste a second longer. I wouldn't want you to miss a ham on rye on my account." Forrest Sherwood was our next-door neighbor here at the shop. He owned Strange Brew, the coffee cafe to the right of us. He was also an old high school acquaintance who'd taken an interest in me since I'd moved back to my hometown, something Wynne didn't seem to care for much. He was always picking at Forrest, who, of course, is thoroughly unaware of Wynne's existence. Wynne's dislike of Forrest leaves me scratching my head sometimes. Forrest's a nice guy who works hard, makes amazing coffee, and has the cutest grandfather ever named Chester. But I didn't have time to address Wynne's sarcastic jabs at Forrest today. Today was all about finding our feet out here in the world of commerce in Ebenezer Falls. Madam Zoltar's had been reopened just a week, and we were finally seeing some foot traffic as curiosity got the better of the locals and tourists alike. Everyone wanted to know if the formerly accused murderer Stevie Cartwright really could communicate with the dead. I won't get into the murder accusation. Suffice it to say, even though I was utterly innocent and totally exonerated, the fact that my fellow Ebenezers had all but tarred and feathered me during the investigation into Madam Zoltar's death still stung. So maybe I still feel a little grudgy, despite how kind the townspeople have been since my good name was cleared. After checking on Belfry and finding him fast asleep, I pushed open the door of what was once Madam Zoltar's small apartment, now our storage/coffee room, and wiggled my finger over my shoulder at Wynne. Pointing to Edward, our grieving boyfriend, who was waiting for me to help him find Kitty's will, I said, "Let's do this, spy guy." "Is everything all right?" Edward asked, his sweet face lined in worry as I re-entered Seance Command Central. I patted him on the hand to reassure him before taking a seat at my brand-new reading table. "Everything's fine. Sometimes I just get so overwhelmed by the spirits and their shenanigans, I need a moment to gather myself and refocus." That's not a lie either. Wynne could make the man above need a moment, so someone like little old mortal me didn't stand a chance. I took in a deep breath and looked Edward square in his eye. Now, where were we? Edward reached his forefinger up under his round, thick, black-rimmed glasses and wiped a tear from his eye. "You said my Kitty was here, right here in the room with us." "Yes, she absolutely is." I closed my eyes again and focused my attention on asking the appropriate questions for Wynne to relay. "Kitty, Edward's here. He wants you to know he misses you very much, and he has a question for you. Can you help?" "Kitty says to tell Edward she's busy," Wynne supplied in a dry tone. The house that Wynne gave me is at the height of renovations with his contractor, Enzo, and it's gorgeous. And he'd lose his ever-lovin' afterlife if anyone were to mar his precious. So, yep, when we got back to the house, I was going to draw on the freshly sheetrocked wall with a black Sharpie. Maybe a peace sign. Or #payback. I stirred in my chair and cleared my throat, our mutually agreed-upon signal for quit screwing around. "So, Kitty, like I said, Edward has a question for you. He'd like to know where you left your will. It's not in the place you said it would be, and your ex-boyfriend Marlin is threatening to take poor Snape away from your beloved Edward. Where did you put your will, Kitty?" "She says she's still busy." I clenched my teeth and muttered under my breath. Well, what is she doing? Her nails? Edward gripped my hand with his sweaty cold one. "Are you really talking to her? What is she saying?" "She said she's busy. I can't make her talk to me, Stevie," Wynne said in exasperation. Rule number 522 clearly states no formal spy interrogation tactics with the spirits. This is inclusive of, but not exclusive to, waterboarding, jumper cables, cigar cutters, any sort of contractor's tool, all forms of bambooish-like torture, fire, bullets, bombs, anything affiliated with bombs, chains, razors, yelling, berating, and or other forceful means that may never be taken when inducing spirit conversation in the afterlife. Your words. I grated out a sigh, forgetting Edward was with us. Oh, we do not either have 522 rules yet. It's only in the 300s, melodrama mama, and I said nothing about razors, but I'm glad you mentioned them. They're definitely out. Please put that on the list. Edward leaned back in his seat, pulling his hand from mine, the vein running along his forehead pulsing. The apprehension on his face was clear. What? I don't understand what she means. What do razors have to do with anything? What's happening? The distress on Edward's face was obvious, from the lines in his forehead shaped in a frown to the downward turn of his trembling mouth. I patted his hand again, then sneezed, giving Wynne the second agreed-upon signal to quit screwing around. If we got to the stage where I coughed, it was DEFCON, and Wynne better be prepared to be on the receiving end of a good tongue-lashing. It's all going to be fine, Edward. Sometimes other spirits interfere with my communication and our signals get crossed. Other spirits? He asked, as he peered at me with watery eyes. Yes, spirits who struggle with simple directions. They're everywhere, all around us. Some even have names that rhyme with Winterbottom. Edward's face went openly confused. You are truly despicable, Stevie Cartwright. You do this all the time, and I have absolutely no way of defending myself. It's cruel. I fought a grin, but just as I reached for Edward's hand once more, there was a commotion outside at the front of the store. A crowd had gathered, the voices floating toward my ear filled with rising hysteria, lifting above the loud music typically blaring in the food court. How odd. But I shrugged it off. Maybe Forrest's grandfather Chester had threatened the kids who skateboarded along the sidewalk with his big broom. Chester was infamous for chasing the local teens when they scooted along the sidewalk, his broom in his chubby weathered hands, held high over his head as he bellowed at them and called them words like miscreants and rugrats. Chester made me giggle. I adored this crabby, chubby little man, and he liked me pretty well, too, but we didn't always have such a mutual admiration for one another. He was the first person to accuse me of murdering Madam Zoltar, totally unfounded and completely reactionary on his part, but at the time it had caused me some serious grief. However, I'd forgiven him since then, and he was now one of the best parts about living here in Ebenezer Falls. I especially loved that he was helping me design gardens for the front of Mayhem Manor. We'd spent hours at the kitchen table, plotting and planning for spring, and I couldn't wait to get my hands in the soil right alongside him. Someone screamed outside, cutting off my thoughts. Edward gripped my hand. What's going on? I rose from my seat and headed toward the new picture window I'd had installed in the front of the store, peering around our blinking Madam Zoltar sign toward the food trucks parked just across the street. Frank Jessup, the manager of the local used bookstore, flew across the street, his eyes wide, his long legs eating up the distance between the food trucks and my store. He looked panicked, maybe even afraid as he ran straight for Forrest's coffee shop, ducking inside. Forgetting about Edward and Kitty, I ran to our front door and pushed it open, the chimes Madam Zoltar had been so fond of tinkling a haunting sound. We were having an unusually warm, sunny day for March in Washington, which had brought a big lunch crowd to the food court. I couldn't see anything through the throngs of heads crammed around my favorite taco vendor's food truck. "He's dead!" someone screamed in a light Spanish accent. My heart began to pound, and I tried to swallow, but my throat kept closing up. No, please don't let it be. And then someone confirmed my deepest dread. Call the police! Tito's dead! The taco man's dead! Chapter 2. Wynn's aura surrounded me, his oddly cool yet somehow warm presence enveloping my space. I often equated it to a hug, but I'd never tell my spy that. If Wynn knew how much he meant to me, especially arriving at a time in my life when everything had been falling apart, I worried he'd find me too needy, too much for a man who'd likely spent a lot of time on his own as a spy, without distractions like sticky relationships to keep him from doing what he had to do. I'd made it my mission to tread lightly when it came to my squishy girl feelings. Damn, Stevie. I'm sorry, love. Wynn's voice caressed my ear, offering the comfort I'd come to relish. I bit the inside of my cheek. I couldn't believe it. Tito was dead? I pushed out of the door, walking into the sunshine blindly, my feet more than familiar with the path I was taking because I'd taken it 100 times before. It was the path that took me directly to the food truck of my favorite taco vendor in the world. The salty sombreros tacos were what had kept me from starving to death when I'd first moved back to Ebenezer Falls after my shunning. At the time, I was alone, without any family but Belfry, pushing poverty and a cardboard box under a bridge somewhere. Tito's lunch specials, 3 for $1 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, allowed me a decent, if not exactly, low-calorie meal. I'd buy as many tacos as I could fit into my purse and my dwindling budget would allow, keep them in the hotel room Belfry and I were staying in, and eat them cold at night for dinner. I loved Tito, even though he'd accused me of murdering Madam Zoltar too. But like Chester, once he'd realized how wrong he was, Tito had gone out of his way to make things right with me. In fact, just last week, as Wynn and I were cleaning up Madam Zoltar's, right before we had our grand reopening, he'd brought free tacos for me and the high school kids I'd hired to help. He'd been all smiles on his roundly cheerful face as he passed out warm, soft flour tortilla tacos in 2s, chatting with me in broken English about getting his final papers next month. He'd been so proud to finally be on the path to getting his American citizenship. He'd recited the Pledge of Allegiance to show me how good his English had become. We'd laughed and laughed when he kept saying, "One nation under God, invisible," instead of indivisible. Dang. The memory felt like someone had just ripped my heart out by way of my belly button. And now he was dead. Could this have something to do with the message Wynn had gotten from the afterlife about a month ago, one we were never able to pursue due to lack of information? A spirit had reached out to me via Wynn, a spirit of Latin descent, a female aura to be precise. She'd requested help with a friend, and then she'd up and disappeared. Wynn had no description of her. He claimed she was just a voice, an older voice who'd said she had a friend here in Ebenezer Falls in need of earthly aid. I told Wynn to tell her we'd get right on it, but then she'd disappeared. I stood just on the fringe of the food truck parking lot in the warm sunshine, seeing the colorful sails bobbing on the choppy waters of the Puget, unable to push past the wall of people. Unable or unwilling, that is. I couldn't pinpoint which. I think I'm still a little raw from my last bout with murder, and my feet are telling my brain to move along, but my heart is telling my brain to piss off. Do you suppose this has to do with the voice that contacted me? Wynn asked what I'd just been thinking. I nodded numbly as the wind caught my caftan, whipping it about my feet. I wondered the same thing. But how could she have known this would happen? In fact, what did happen? Dang. Seems like we can't keep anybody alive in this darn town, Chester muttered as he came to stand next to me, threading his arm through mine and leaning into me while we shared the view of the small parking lot. Many times when I peeked out the picture window of Madam Z's between readings, I'd look out over the sea of multicolored trucks parked in a semicircle end to end and smile at the people who lived in my town and frequented the carts, rain or shine. Families, couples, everyone who made up Ebenezer Falls, strolling and enjoying the one thing we all did universally, eat, and the sight always made my heart warm. But today, even as the sun beat down on our heads via a cloudless sky, while tulips and daffodils bloomed all around us in the beds the community had built, and despite happy music blaring from speakers set about the court area, the trucks looked less cheerful. I noted Jacob, the fish and chips guy who owned the deep-sea diver, wasn't in the vicinity today. Sally, over at the Sunshine Inn, had mentioned he skirted the permits necessary to park and serve food whenever possible. Today was probably a smart day to avoid the place altogether. The breeze picked up, bringing with it the call of seagulls and bighorns as Ebenezer Falls celebrated this unusual break in the weather. Still, my eyes went back to the area where I suspected Tito was sprawled. Do you know what happened, Chester? He shook his silvery white head and patted my arm, his normally twinkling eyes somber. Nope. And this time I'm going to be real careful about what I say, girlie. I don't want you going to jail for round 2, or we'll never get those gardens done. I'd laugh if I didn't still remember what the interior of an Ebenezer Falls holding cell looked like, thanks to a whole lot of unfounded suspicion on not just Chester's part, but the police department's too. Stevie, you okay? Forrest asked from behind me, his tall presence strong and reassuring. He placed one of his big hands on my shoulder and squeezed before moving to stand on the opposite side of his grandfather. I'm fine. I had nothing to do with this one, if that's what you're wondering. I tried to joke, but inside my guts were all ripped up. There'd never be another taco like Tito's Supreme Grande soft taco, slathered with sour cream, guacamole, and of all things, dandelion leaves. Never. I often thought Tito was trying to fit in with the latest fad of organic meets traditional in order to continue to compete in the marketplace with some of the more foodie-minded trucks. But the line at his door every day was proof enough he didn't need tofu and quinoa to make a sale. Thankfully, someone had the smarts to turn off the music, and only hushed whispers now pervaded the food court. The police arrived then in a wave of sirens and flashing red and blue lights, the screams of the ambulance not far behind before their tires came to a screeching halt. As the crowd parted to allow the paramedics and police through, I got my first real glimpse of Tito, splayed out on the concrete in front of his festive pink and mint green food truck, with the dancing sombrero splashed across the side right next to the menu for all that taco goodness. He'd often said the colors of his food truck were meant to represent his life. Fun, colorful, like a Mexican hat dance every single day. Bloody hell, Wynne muttered in my ear. Exactly what I was thinking. Is that what I think it is? Chester asked in a somber hush, tightening his grip on my arm. I think it is, Pops, Forrest said, his voice wooden and perplexed, if one's tone could be such at the same time. It absolutely was what Chester thought it was. Cheese. Tito's whole shiny ebony head was covered in cheese. The gloriously velvety, mildly spicy, brilliantly orange-yellow cheese he so generously poured over his not-so-naked nachos and topped with slow-cooked brisket, chives, and jalapenos. Another of my favorites. There was also a trail of cheese from his truck to where he'd fallen. Okay, so after my last experience, here's where I should bow out, right? March myself right back to my shop, finish Edward's reading, and ignore anything to do with a potential murder case. Because, let's face it, I'd been to this rodeo. The difference was, this time I hadn't been anywhere near Tito or his truck when he was found. Unlike the last time, when I was in Madam Z's shop with her dead body when the police arrived, with Chester hot on their heels ready to burn me at the stake. Back then, it never even occurred to me that Madam Z had been murdered. My first thought was that she'd had a heart attack. And that had been my first thought here, too, but I'd learned real quick about first impressions after my run-ins with the law and a real live killer. But then I had a crazy niggle that what happened here was none of those things. The one I used to get when I was a witch. The one that was never wrong. And that niggle said Tito's death had to do with foul play. Heart attack, Stroke? Chester asked, his gruff voice smaller today. It sure looks that way, I agreed, despite the gnawing, nay, burning, protest of my gut.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?